Hello, I'm Steele, and welcome back to Railroads Online. So, this is going to be a little shorter episode as like a mini episode in between, because in the last episode, obviously, we ran up to the iron mine rather unsuccessfully, and we resolved that in this episode we would buy a Class 48 along with Bockworm and do a bit of a better job. However, I've decided that first and foremost, I needed to get a bit of extra building and rebuilding done, and then this episode I want to actually walk through the build process as I build from the iron mine, from our little Y up here in this area, down to the smelter. First I'll show you around some of the things I've done since the last episode. So as you can see, our freight depot, previously this freight depot track here just came to a sudden stop with the turntable. Now instead it loops right the way around the back there, and in between, in the space inside that loop, we've got our water table, a water tower, turntable, a couple of engine sheds, and a rolling stock shed. So this open shed I think I would like to use for maintenance of way type equipment when we eventually get it. So things like snow plows and spare cabooses and such will get stored in there. The other thing I've done is I have actually rebuilt the iron mine line that gave us so much trouble last episode, which does make it a little bit higher off the ground at some points, but means that instead of ridiculous grades, it's a nice leisurely 6%, which is still ridiculous, but slightly less ridiculous and a little bit more achievable. In fact, I have actually off camera done a little bit of running with the Glenbrook, and the Glenbrook can pull 4 cars up it now instead of 1, which is nice. The other thing I've done is I've added a little bit more building here at the iron mine. As you can see, we've got this nice little shelter over where the beams and lumber get stored when you load them off. With that, I think our next step will be to jump into actually getting some building done. Right, so the very first thing I've done is actually, here I am up at the Y above the smelter that leads off to the iron mine, and you can see I've revamped things a little bit. The first thing I did was I actually adjusted the alignment of this Y, because in the previous episode this switch here, which is going to branch off to the smelter, was kind of veering right off a cliff. It still is, but now if I build a bridge, we'll eventually hit a hill, whereas previously it was kind of just pointing off in that direction, which would have been very useless. But the big thing you will have noticed is that I've actually added some nice cosmetic builds. I've added these little bridges over the water that look quite nice, and I think that the stone wall really helps set them in a bit, gives a bit of transition from the gravel to the bridge, and also makes it feel a bit more solid and sturdy for being placed directly in a river. Admittedly, I do wish they allowed us to build these trestle bridges, these ones, without any walkway attached, because this kind of bridge is the kind that would actually be used for a low-level river crossing like that. But I didn't really want the handrails because I've got 2 of them right next to each other here, and I think it would look a little bit weird to have that. Feel free to let me know if you disagree there. But the other thing I have also done is I've added this little telegraph house. The telegraph house is because this spot is going to become quite high traffic as we progress, because anything from this side of the map to any of these industries here is going to need to pass through this section that we are standing at right now, which means it's going to become quite high traffic, so we're going to want a telegraph house. And the thing I've done is I've just given it this little tiny cosmetic build just so it's got a little railing out the front just as a nice thing, and you can see I've added a water tower. Now, do I think we will ever actually need a water tower at this Y here? No, absolutely not. But the reason that I think this is quite a good fit is that we want people to be, me and Bockworm, to be going fairly slow through this Y, as you don't want to be coming quick through it, because in real railway operations you are not supposed to go particularly fast through a switch, and having this kind of facilities built right next to the track makes it feel a bit less like a bit of mainline section and a bit more like an area that you should be going slow through, as though it's a yard or something. So the other thing I've done is I have built a telegraph house down to the smelter, but I've got nothing built there, which is the next thing. Because when you are building a railway in this game between 2 points, generally you want to have those 2 points built out entirely first and foremost. I do not want to be building a route down to the smelter and then figuring out what I'm going to do here, because then the way that the track comes in might be really, really inconvenient, and I don't have a clear direction. So the thing is, I've already got where it's going to come from up at the top there. Now I need to make where it's going to arrive to down at the bottom here. as you can see, the very first thing I've done is line up and build the actual loading and unloading tracks as just single little segments next to the platforms. And the reason for that is just that at an industry, that is the most important thing, is the loading and unloading points. So make sure to build those first and then fit all the rest of your track around it, because ultimately that is your goal, so everything else should be built to fit it. And the next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to build our exit point from this industry out onto the main line. Now, my current plan is that we've got our switch up at the top here that heads down this way. So what I want to do is I want to have a route that loops around, crosses over this canyon here, and comes into the smelter on that side, which means the next step is to build out track in this direction and add a switch there that will switch off onto the main line, and then we will start building our actual railway route. And after a fair bit of work, I have now constructed a whole entire smelter layout, so I'll probably edit in some kind of things to show what I'm talking about. But the tracks are going to come in off the left there, and you can see I've got this big loop right around the whole thing and a second loop, which just means that you can kind of have multiple trains on the whole thing, because of course you're going to have trains coming in from the main line that are going to be dropping off iron ore. Then you also have trains that will be coming in off the main line to pick up iron products heading in a different direction, and you'll have trains coming in from that Y at the back there that'll be bringing cordwood out from under the bridge. Eventually, I haven't built a route there yet. And of course, the other thing is, of course, you can see my cordwood unloading tracks, my iron ore unloading track, and I've got like a passing line next to the iron ore loading track so that cordwood trains can come by and do their unloading while iron ore trains are doing the same, which is also why there's that second loop on the left there. But now that this is all done, it's time to start building the actual smelter line. And one of the things that I've done to help with this is I've built a telegraph house at the exit to the track. So if we come down here, this is that end of the track there, and this telegraph house will now serve as essentially a marker on the map. So it means that I can see right where I need to be aiming without actually being there. This other one there is where I was just standing, which is a floating turntable there. So I'll remove that in a moment, and then I'll get into the actual building, and I'll probably walk you through a bit of that, kind of come to you every now and again just to show what I'm doing, how I'm doing it. One thing I want to mention actually, now that I've started building, is that whenever you are building a route in this game, and the two industries you're aiming to are on two different elevations, which is pretty much every route in the game, you want to make sure that you start at the higher elevation point and work your way downhill as you're building. Working the other way works out to be a lot more difficult, because when you're coming downhill, if you get the grade wrong, you can just loop around and have another crack at it. But if you're heading uphill and you get the grade wrong, you'll more often than not find yourself running straight into a hill or a cliff and having to rebuild essentially the whole route if you want to alter the grade. So yeah, generally start from the top, work your way downwards, not the other way around. The only real exception to that is, for example, when I was building the iron mine line, originally I did work from the bottom up, and that's just because I was following the developer cut. But you could see that even didn't really work at all, because we couldn't pull even a single car at it. And so I ended up having to rebuild the whole thing off camera, working from the top down to keep the grades a bit more sensible. And after quite a bit of work, we've actually made it right the way down to the bottom, but here you can kind of see, first of all, it's very stupid looking, this weird loop around thing, but it's a good example of why it helps to work from the top down. Because what happened here is essentially I've arrived just before the smelter lead track and realized that I was not low enough, so then I've just looped around and made this weird S-bend type thing. If you were going uphill and working uphill and you missed instead, you would have just plowed straight into a mountain, whereas this way you can do stuff that's a bit stupid but at least sort of works. And so from this high vantage point we can kind of see a bit more of the route. It kind of loops around, loops right over, and then it heads off towards the smelter Y. So that is pretty much the route complete, and the final step will just be to log and remove all of the trees. This overview should sort of show you the actual route now. So most of it's at 2%, there's a brief section of 3%, and as you can see it's a bit of a spaghetti bowl of track to try and get everything to work within that, keeping the grade fairly shallow, whereas on the iron mine it's up to like 6% grades. But I think that's partially just because you're going to have really quite heavy and probably fairly long trains operating on this route, so you don't want it to be too ridiculously steep. But honestly, I think it's actually going to make it really quite scenic, because it means that you've kind of got the track within view of itself in a lot of places. There's a lot of, little bridges that are quite low to the ground, which I always find quite scenic. And then, of course, there's that off to the left, there's that massive steel bridge arching out over the river. Eventually, I might rebuild this route to be a little bit better off camera, might extend things at the steel bridge, extend that further back into the hills before I cross the canyon, and then do the same on the right as well, as extend it further back into the hills before looping around, and that would make it a bit less spaghetti, a bit more direct, and probably allow the whole thing to be 2%. But right now, I think this is a really good build and a really good place to leave this episode. I hope you've enjoyed seeing this little glimpse into how I actually build a railway and a few little tips. Sorry that it's kind of a very short episode, just a mini little thing in between. If you liked it, feel free to drop a like or something. If you didn't like it, please tell me, like if you'd rather I focus on just running trains in these videos instead of putting out this kind of content. But I figured it was a good way to put a little bit of something out for you folks while doing stuff that otherwise would just be off-camera work anyway. With that, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.